All right, so in 3.5, we are doing the completing the square method. This is going to be another no calculator section. And then your next quiz is going to be no calculator, okay? So make sure when you're doing your practice, doing that without your calculator. So we're going to be solving quadratic equations by completing the square, and we're going to use the square root property to solve quadratic equations. So we're going to have two methods to solve these quadratics. So let's write down what the square root property is using mathematical symbols. Okay, so the square root property tells us if you have x squared equal to some number, which we're going to call n, then the first thing you're going to do is we are going to take the square root of both sides. I'm just going to abbreviate square. When you are the one taking the square root, you need your plus or minus. And we are going to have to simplify radicals where possible. So you might hear like, oh, you need an exact value or it needs to be in simplest radical form. Okay, that's when you have to simplify radicals. And of course, when we're simplifying radicals, what we're looking for are perfect squares. Okay, so let's write this out. You're going to take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of x squared, okay, the square root and the square are inverse operations, so it undoes that power, and then you're going to have plus or minus the square root of n, and then whatever that value is of n, if there's a perfect square underneath, okay, then you are going to simplify that. Okay, so you have to look for perfect squares. And again, these are called exact values. And it's called simplest radical form. Okay, so if you ever hear me say it has to be an exact value or it has to be in simplest radical form, what that means is any radical has to have a perfect square taken out of it. Okay, so if it's the square root of 18, there's a perfect square in 18, you have to simplify. Okay, which is what we did in 3.3 as well with those imaginary numbers. Okay, so examples 1 through 3, it says solve each equation by using the square root property. So solve using the square root property. Okay, so for number 1, well, letter A in examples 1 through 3, x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 49. Okay, and just so you guys know, if you're ever like, why does she call this examples 1 through 3 and not just example 1? It's because I lined it up with your textbook. Okay, so your textbook does something similar, and so I like to make those the same. So if you're having trouble, you can go back and you can look at these. Okay? So your first step for these is to factor the perfect square trinomial. So you need to recognize that when it says the square root property. So when it says that solve by the square root property, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to try to factor this on the left side. because 16 is a perfect square, okay, x squared is a perfect square. If you were to move that 49 over, okay, that is not going to be a perfect square anymore. If you were to subtract 49. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with x times x to get x squared. If it multiplies to 16, the first thing I would try are the perfect squares. 4 times 4, and then I'm checking with FOIL. 4 times x and 4 times x is going to add to 8x. So remember, we can write that, okay, so we're factoring using the perfect square trinomial. Okay, we can write that as x plus 4 squared equals 49. Okay, so all of that is step 1. Okay, and then once you have it, you're going to take the square root and put in your plus or minus. I'll get it. You guys can do this step. Okay, so once you take the square root, did you put the plus or minus in front of the square root of 49? Okay, so when you take the square root, make sure you put plus or minus in front of the square root of 49. Okay, so again, the square root undoes the 2. You have plus or minus 7. Okay, and then our last step is going to be to solve for x. Okay, so we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. Now, what you need to understand with one like this is this means a few different things, okay? So this means that you can do positive 7 minus 4 and negative 7 minus 4. Okay, you're going to have 2 different answers here. So if you do 7 minus 4, you get 3. You do negative 7 minus 4, you get negative 11. So your final answer is x equals 3 or negative 11. Okay, so if it is a whole number, you are going to have 2 whole numbers as your final answer here. Okay, you can find those values. All right, so based on that, I want you to do the first 2 steps for part B. And if you want to go further, you can. This one is a little bit different. Okay, but the first 2 steps are going to be the same. So see if you can replicate that process. So how'd those first couple steps go? Okay, and then even though it's not a perfect square, you guys know how to simplify that, right? Okay, so if you haven't simplified yet, go ahead and do that, and you can check with me. When you are doing this step, okay, you guys can jump to this part here. It's just, I know some of us are still struggling a little bit with the factoring. If it multiplies to a positive, signs have to be the same. And if this is a negative, the only way to get negative 12 is two negative values. So negative 6 plus negative 6 is negative 12. Negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36. And then we're able to write this as a power. And if we're able to write it as a power, then remember the directions say use the square root property? Then we're able to use the square root property. Okay, and then we're going to write this as plus or minus. And then if it's the square root of 28, I want you to either do your factor tree, or we should know the perfect square in 28. What is it? 4. It's root 4 times root 7. So this is going to be 2 root 7. Right? Because 4 times 7 is 28, right? Okay, and what's the square root of 4? 2. So we're just rewriting it there. If you want a factor tree, you can. So 2 and 14, 2 and 7. Anytime there's a group of 2, it comes out. So whichever way you're comfortable with is fine. Now, when we do the last step, when we're adding this over, we can't add the whole number and the root. So this is how we're going to write our final answer. We're going to put this value in front. So it's 6 plus or minus 2 root 7. Okay, you do not have to write those two answers out separately. You can if you want to. You can write 6 plus 2 root 7 and 6 minus 2 root 7. Okay, but you don't have to. So generally, we put this value in front. We keep that plus or minus in the middle. All right, so I know some of us are at different places here. So some of you are just ready to rock and roll. So I'm going to let you rock out to part C and D. And then I'm going to come around. So if you need a little more guidance or have a question for me, I can help you with that. Okay, so now we've reviewed a few things that are going to help you be successful on part C and D. So let's check in on part C. It looks like you are doing a really nice job. And then I'm just going to help you simplify the last step. So once you factor this into 5x minus 1 squared, right, because you have 5, negative 1 because this is negative. Okay, and like I said, it's okay if you are recognizing that pattern right away and you write it as squared. Now, don't forget your plus or minus here, okay? And then you can either factor tree or root 75. You can go through your perfect squares, right? Perfect squares are 4, 9, 15, 25. What one goes into 75? 25. So it's what you're doing is you're breaking this up into 2 square roots. Root 25 times root 3. You know the square root of 25 is 5. That's why we can write this as 5 root 3. And then you guys did a nice job of adding over the 1 plus or minus 5 root 3. And then the last step is dividing by 5. Now when you do this, similar to what we did with the imaginary values, if you divide 1 by 5 and 5 root 3 by 5, you can simplify here. So anything that's on the outside, if that reduces, 5 divided by 5 is just 1. You can cancel those out. So your final answer is going to be 1/5 plus or minus root 3. Okay, and that last step is kind of tricky, so we haven't done a lot of that. So if you got here, that's awesome. If you got here, that's great. And then we're just going to take that one step further. Okay, and I also saw you guys did a really nice job remembering to put the I in. Okay, so if it's x squared, you're going to start with x. Square root of 64 is 8, so this is x plus 8 squared. We're going to take the square root of both. So x plus 8 equals plus or minus 7i. Okay, don't forget the plus or minus. Your last step is to subtract this over. Okay, so negative 8 plus or minus 7i is going to be your final answer. You cannot combine those together. Okay, and this is in the form a plus bi. You just have your two answers with your plus or minus here. Okay, and then just remember, anytime you have a negative, you replace it with I. Square root of 49 is the 7. So that's how we're getting there. All right, nice work. In example 4, it says find the value of C. Find the value of C that makes each trinomial a perfect square. Then write the trinomial as the square of a binomial. So we're doing two things. We're finding the value of C, then we're writing the trinomial as the square of a binomial. That's really has a lot of big words in it, doesn't it? So a trinomial is just 3 terms. Okay, a binomial is 2 terms. All right, so let's do an example and just put some more meaning to what these directions are asking us to do. When they're telling you to write the trinomial as the square of a binomial, all you're going to do is write this in factored form. Okay, I do think it's important for you to write down these notations for the directions, because when we get to a quiz and we put a bunch of things together, that's one of the associations we're going to have to make. What is the question asking me? Okay, so when you're doing this, you have x squared minus 14x plus c. We're trying to find what your c value is. So in order to do this, you want to think of 2 values that are going to add to negative 14 that are the same number. Okay, so what 2 numbers would add to negative 14? Negative 7 and negative 7. Okay, so if this is what you factored it to, what would your value of c be? Negative 7 times negative 7 would be 49. Okay, there is a formula to help you find this that I'm going to share with you. So one way you can do this is you can find this value, which we call b, and you can take half of it and you can square it. Okay, and this is going to be your value of c. So it's half of negative 14 squared. Okay, so if your b value is negative 14, you do negative 14 divided by 2 squared, you get negative 7 squared, which is 49. Okay, and that is what we did. We were asking ourselves, okay, what number plus what same number would be negative 14? Okay, we just cut that in half to find it. Okay, then we multiplied it together, which is going to be the same thing as squaring it. And then the final thing we have to do is write this in factored form. So if we write x minus 7 times x minus 7 in factored form, it's just going to be x minus 7 squared. Okay, this is the square of the binomial. Okay, those are the two things I asked you to do. All right, so then for b, let's try using this formula here. Okay, so your b value is always in front of the x. So let's cut it in half. 6 divided by 2 is going to be 3, thank you. And then 3 squared is going to be 9. So that's going to be your value for c. Okay, then to write the trinomial as the square of a binomial, what you're doing is factoring this. So if you have x squared plus 6x plus 9, if you factor that, you can start with x and x, what multiplies to 9 but adds to 6, 3 and 3. So we just have to write it as x plus 3 squared. Okay, so half of your b, you square it. Once you have your c value, you can factor it like we have been doing. All right, now the last one here, x squared minus 7x plus c. Let's use our equation again. Our b value this time is negative 7. If this is a decimal, we're going to keep it as a fraction. So leave as a fraction, not a decimal. Okay, so instead of making that negative 3.5 and squaring it, remember we're doing this without a calculator, okay? So you're not going to want to do that anyway. When you square a fraction, all you have to do is square the numerator and square the denominator. So negative 7 squared is 49, 2 squared, 4. This is your c value. Okay, so that's going to be a lot easier than multiplying out negative 3.5 times negative 3.5. Also going to be a lot easier when we do our factoring. Okay, so when you go to your factoring, you have x squared minus 7x plus 49 over 4. Okay, so we start with x and x. This has to be a positive. This is going to be a negative. Okay, let's look at some of these patterns. This was 9. Look what we put in here. 3. This was 49. This was 7. How can I go from 49 to 7? Square root. How can I go from 9 to 3? Square root. So to find this one, all I have to do is take the square root. So the square root of the fraction, what's the square root of 49? 7. Square root of 4, 2. Okay, do you notice this is also what we have in the parentheses here? So here, here, and here. Okay, so then this is going to be your binomial. Okay, what questions do we have in example 4? This is going to lead us into completing with the square root property. Okay, so when you are solving by completing the square, the coefficient of x squared has to be a certain value. Okay, the coefficient of x squared, okay, the coefficient of x squared must be 1. Do you guys remember what letter we call the coefficient of x squared? A. So your A value has to be 1. Okay, the coefficient of x squared must be 1. If it's not, all you have to do is divide by that value. So if not, then divide each side by the A value. Okay, so you can mathematically manipulate the equation. Okay, you can divide both sides by the A value so that you have an A of 1. So for part A, we're going to start with x squared equals 12x minus 20. Okay, and we're just going to, I'm going to write it here and then do all the steps with you, okay? So x squared equals 12x minus 20. If you're not sure what to do, okay, I spend a lot of time making these note sheets for you so that you can have a guide that can help you. So step 1, get all your variable terms on one side. Now really, it doesn't matter what side you get them on, but do you see how right now your A value is 1? I don't want to have to manipulate anything else, so I'm going to move everything to that side. Okay, and that's your only variable terms. So variable terms just means your x terms here. Okay, so you have x squared minus 12x equals negative 20. Okay, done. Is the coefficient, this should say, of A. So yes, A is equal to 1. Okay, and then the next thing says fill in the blank spaces with. So we're going to create these blank spaces, okay? And it's going to be really similar to what we did in our last example. So we have x squared minus 12x plus blank equals negative 20 plus blank. So we put these blank spaces just to show that these should be equal. Really what you're doing is you have to make this a perfect square. And so we're going to use the same formula that we used on the other side to find that value of C. So we're going to do B divided by 2 squared. Okay, now when I write this in, I write it like this at first. Okay, so if I do negative 12 divided by 2, I get negative 6, and then I'm going to square it. Okay, so I'm going to fill in the space. Negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6 squared. Now I know that this is going to be 36. So if I'm adding 36 to this side, I have to add 36 to the other side. Okay, mathematically, if you do something to one side, you have to do that to the other side. And then what we're going to do is we are going to write this in factored form. So if you are writing this in factored form, what you have is x squared minus 12x plus 36. If you factor that, based on what we've been doing, remember that this is going to be a perfect square trinomial. So if this is a perfect square trinomial, see if you can factor this side. so what we should factor this into is x minus 6 squared. And then this is going to be 16. So negative 20 plus 36 is going to get you 16. Okay, so we add this to complete the square by making this a perfect square. That's why it's called completing the square, because this is a perfect square trinomial now. And if that's a perfect square trinomial, I can solve using the square root property. So you can take the square root, take the square root, plus or minus 4. And then can you see that this step is going to be exactly like what we did at the beginning of today's notes? Okay, so you're finding two things, right? You have 4 plus 6, you have negative 4 plus 6. Okay, so here you have 10, here you have 2, so your x value is 10 or 2. Okay, so anytime you are writing in factored form, it is going to be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, that's why it's called completing the square. All right, so for part B, we want all the variable terms on one side. We want all of the non-variable terms on the other side. So I have x squared on this side. Right now, my a value is 1. I want to keep it that way, so I'm going to move the 9x over to this side. So I have x squared minus 9x. And then I'm also, at the same time, going to add 2 to both sides. Okay, so this should be your setup. You should have the x terms on one side, the number term on the other side. Okay, and then can you see if you can fill in those blanks using the b over 2 squared? Okay, so your b value is negative 9. Remember, I like to write the half of it squared in the first blank. I just find I make less mistakes that way, and I'll show you a little shortcut. So once you square this, if you square something that's negative, it is a positive. So negative 9 squared is 81, 2 squared is going to be 4. And then when you go to factor this, remember how we talked about every single time when we factored this, it ended up being the same as this value here. If you want, you can just go ahead and you can factor and make this x minus 9 over 2 squared. Okay, anytime you have a perfect square trinomial, it's either going to be x plus b over 2 squared or x minus b over 2 squared. Okay, when you factor, it's going to be one of those. So use that to your advantage. Now we have to remember how to add together fractions. So we need a common denominator, which will be 4. So if this is 2 over 1, in order to make the denominator 4, you have to multiply 2 by 4. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. Add them together. So you get 89 over 4. Okay, and And then once you've done that, now you're ready to take the square root. Okay, when you take the square root, you're going to have x minus 9 over 2 equals plus or minus. Anytime you have a fraction, split this up into the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. Because in this case, you can simplify. What's the square root of 4? 2. Okay, are there any perfect squares in 89? No, so you're going to keep it as the square root of 89. It's not even, okay, so 4 is not going to go in there. It doesn't end in 5. 25 isn't going to go in there. Okay, 81 is too close to be able to go in there. So you can check all your perfect squares. None of them are going to go in. Okay, and then your last step is just to add 9 over 2. So your final answer is x equals, and we just put 9 over 2 plus or minus root 89 over 2. Okay, so this one you can't simplify root 89. You do need to check. Sometimes we'll simplify, sometimes they will not. All right, and then for part C, you have everything on the right side. Okay, we just want to rearrange it so it's 3x squared plus 18x equals 45. Okay, and in this situation, a does not equal 1. So when that happens, you have to divide everything by 3. That's your a value. And this one is pretty nice because everything divides into it evenly. That might not always happen, but we've seen ones where it's odd or a fraction, so we can practice those. So now we have x squared plus 6x. I'm going to put my blank in here because I know that's my next step. Okay, and let's see if you can go ahead and finish that. All right, so half of b is 3. 3 squared is 9. What's 15 plus 9? 24. Take the square root. Okay, and then when we see 24, do we know what the perfect square is in 24? 4. Okay, so square root of 24 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 6, which simplifies to 2 root 6. So that's what we're going to write here. Okay, you can go from here to here. Okay, I just know some people are still having trouble visualizing how to simplify, so I'm writing that out for you. Okay, so then x is going to be negative 3 plus or minus 2 root 6.